Hello, it's me again. I want to talk to you guys about um, black people of African diaspora, the type of oppression that they have experienced, and how it is different from any other racist oppression. Many people say that because Chinese people were discriminated against, Japanese people were discriminated against, Jews were discriminated against, Polish people were discriminated against, Italians were discriminated against, Mexicans were discriminated against, all these other people were discriminated against, and many of those groups have risen and overcame that discrimination and are more accepted. Why are black people still, although they have made some progress, still slower to succeed or make the progress? The black struggle still has a slower route. Why does the black struggle have a slower route? Some people make, and that's why many whites, not all, but many whites have this resentment toward black people, because they feel other minority people have been discriminated against. Why do black people complain so much? Why do black people portray themselves as victims, as historical victims, or they're not victims now? Well, two parts to that question. Number one, black people are still victims now of racism, not mean-spirited racism, not overt conscious racism that white nationalists would love to see come back in America, justified through science or scientific theory. That type of racism, scientific theory racism, conscious one, is pretty obsolete right now. But the result racism that I've expressed in a couple of videos, result racism and subconscious racism expressed through how they behave and treat black people, is collectively creating oppression, which makes it harder for them to succeed. Not impossible, but harder to succeed. Still exists. Secondly, black people cannot and should not forget that for pre-1965 or pre-1975, they were victims. That's just reality. So we're talking about, 1965, the Civil Rights Bill came out, but clearly we've got obviously think that we still had a very strong overt racist society. So let's just say 5 years from there, like I would say give it about 10 years to get rid of all that overt racism. We're talking about 32 years of just overt racism being gone. And we're talking about 400, at least, not that 400, at least 500 years, mostly of slavery and colonialism in Africa toward black people. Yes, you white people had nothing to do with it. But you cannot say that you do not benefit from it. The perfect example is the South. The South was based on exploiting black people as slaves. They got free labor. They didn't get cheap labor, they got free labor to build the South, to build the Southern economy. That's something that, look, I'm sure, it's not something great to hear it's not something that you want to hear. It's not something you want to hear 24 hours a day. But it still won't erase the fact that's what happened. So black people have been a victim of racism for 400 years, subjugated. And yes, it is kind of a curse, because if you start to have this victim mentality, you may never get out of it. So you got to balance out being a victim and how to empower yourself, but you can never forget that you are a victim now, although it's not intentional, and you were there, and it was a conscious intent to victimize you for 400 plus years. There's no way that you can get out of that. And to tell black people just to forget it, just because it raises you, it feeds your conscience. I'm sorry. That's the race reality. The white nationalists want to talk about race reality. That's the race reality. And it's not in this continent, just in this continent. All over. Britain, we're talking about Britain. Africa. Okay. Imperialism in Africa and how that worked. That was a little different, but still some of the same patterns we're going to see. So, but we're not in Africa, we're talking about in America. So there has been no other race except the black race, which when they originally came over here was very dark, very radically different from white people. Okay, very radically different in how they looked. That was enslaved, that was subjugated, that was discriminated against, that was exploited for 400 years. That's the historical pattern. So 40 years of being free doesn't cut it. Now, how about the Italians? Were the Irish discriminated against? Yes, they were. But again, an Irish person and another white person look a lot closer than a black person. They have a lot more similarities. Okay, they're both light skinned and they're really both white. So a white Irish person can just get rid of their name and assimilate in white society. Just get an Anglo-Saxon name. Same thing for the white Jew. Get an Anglo-Saxon name. Italians are a little bit different, but remember, if we compare it to even an average dark-skinned person like Dark Warrior, that Italian and that white Anglo have a lot more similarities. Even the Asian person. If you look at the Asian person, they have more similar features to a white person than they have to an African person that has kinky hair. Okay. So blacks stood out. I mean, with the dark skin resembled savagery, lower intelligence. The darker you are, the more savage you were. Just like these white nationalists are saying. The smart black people are the ones with white blood. They're saying that if they're smart, they look more Caucasoid. The further they get away from Caucasoid races, the more savage, the more mentally incapable, mentally incompetent they are. So just remember that. I'm sure black people do get tired of being called a victim. But what happens? But you know what happens is when some whites and even some blacks start to ignore that there was no historical pattern of oppression and act like black people should be seceding and should ignore racism, and who cares if racism exists, and you know everybody else has racism, no big deal, what do you do? It's not going to happen. That's the way it is. That's the race reality. So that IQ store, the IQ store is a race reality, but also this racism is a race reality too. So the only thing I can tell people is that if you're called out, because there's people that study racism and catch people in racist patterns, I mean very blatant racist patterns, unquestionable racist patterns, the only thing I can tell you is correct your behavior. That's all you need to do. You don't need to feel guilt. You don't need to feel sorry. Correct your behavior. Analyze yourself. Because I have racist tendencies toward my own race. So I know most whites do have racist tendencies. Analyze. Do you have a practical reason in believing this? If it's no, then correct the behavior. Because the smallest thing, giving change, putting the change on the counter for black people. If you're a cashier, putting the change on the counter for black people, giving it in the hands for white people. Little things like that. Black people pick up. So if you have a little uneasiness or bias, black people are smart. They can pick it up. Do they sometimes go overboard and say everything's racism? Of course.